You won't believe what happened next. No one thought it could ever come to this, but the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows across the quiet suburban street. At 80 years old, Ethel Richards was already awake, stepping carefully down her concrete pathway with a steady determination. Her hands, worn from years of life's hardships, gripped her cane not because she needed it, but because her daughter, Laura, insisted on it after Ethel had taken a small fall last winter. Every morning, rain or shine, Ethel followed the same routine that had been her life for the past 50 years since moving to her house in 1974. First came the flag-raising ceremony, her private tribute to the friend she had lost in World War II, a quiet moment of remembrance. Her fingers, arthritic yet steady, worked the rope with practiced precision as the American flag slowly climbed into the sky. The neighbors knew her well. Ethel, with her soft blue cardigan, neatly pressed slacks, and polished shoes, she still shined every Sunday evening. What they didn't know was that she polished those shoes while sitting in her favorite armchair, remembering the strict military discipline instilled in her during her younger years. This particular Tuesday morning, like all others, Ethel had plans for the garden. Her roses needed pruning, as they always did. The roses had become her life's passion, something to nurture since her husband, Jack, had passed away 5 years ago. "Good morning, Mrs. Richards." Jenny, the 12-year-old girl from next door, called as she zipped by on her bicycle. Ethel smiled and waved, remembering how Jenny had helped her plant tulip bulbs the year before. The neighborhood kids had taken to calling her Grandma Ethel, even though she had no grandchildren. Laura and her husband, Greg, never had kids, but Ethel found a kind of family in the community she had served for so long. As she made her way to the shed to grab her gardening gloves, Ethel couldn't help but remember the long days during the war, when she was just a young woman volunteering with the Navy. Her mind wandered back to those days as she carefully trimmed away at her roses, wondering if her younger self would ever have imagined this life of peaceful solitude in her suburban home. The gentle hum of a car horn snapped Ethel back to the present. Mrs. Rodriguez, the neighbor from the corner house, was passing by with her grandkids in tow. The elderly woman always gave a two-note honk as a special greeting. Ethel straightened up slowly, her body protesting the effort, and waved in return. The quiet morning continued as it always had, peaceful, serene, and deeply familiar. Then, something unexpected happened. The first roar of a motorcycle engine broke the silence, followed by another, then another. Ethel frowned and squinted out the window, watching as the motorcycle sped past her house. This wasn't the usual weekend noise. They circled around and pulled into the abandoned warehouse across the street, a place that had been empty for years. What began as the sound of a few motorcycles grew into a thunderous rumble as more and more bikes pulled up. Ethel counted at least 20, maybe 30, bikers. Their jackets were adorned with a red snake symbol, and their leader, a tall man with a shaved head, directed them with confidence as they broke the chains on the warehouse doors. Ethel's peaceful street was being invaded. As she sat in her favorite armchair, the roar of engines became a constant background hum. Her mind raced back to the days when she had fought for her country. She had faced much worse than this, hadn't she? This was just noise. They couldn't break her. As the roar of the motorcycles echoed in her ears, Ethel Richards set down her pruning shears with a quiet click. She watched from the window, her brow furrowing as the bikers unloaded boxes from the back of their bikes and disappeared into the abandoned warehouse. Something wasn't right. For the first time in years, Ethel's hands trembled. It wasn't from age or her arthritis, but from a deep, instinctual recognition. These were troublemakers, and she wasn't about to let them take over her peaceful neighborhood. Ethel had seen it all. The firestorms in the Pacific, the tension in Berlin, the quiet resolve of those who had sacrificed everything for their country. The bikers, with their leather jackets and tattoos, might have intimidated the average person, but not Ethel. She had seen far worse. As she stood, grabbing her cane and making her way toward the door, the street outside grew noisier. The bikers began shouting to each other, laughter echoing as the sound of engines revved again. Her neighbors, who normally kept to themselves, began peeking out from behind their curtains, some even stepping out onto their porches. Ethel paused at the door for a moment, staring out at the scene. This wasn't just about noise or nuisance. This felt like something more, a challenge to the community she had protected for so long. Her military training kicked in, old habits resurfacing. She was a woman who had survived wartime and faced down enemies much more dangerous than this. But there was something else. The one thing the bikers didn't know was that Ethel Richards wasn't just any veteran. She had served as an intelligence officer, working behind the scenes, quietly pulling strings, gathering information. She'd never been one for boasting. Most of her colleagues didn't even know she'd been stationed in Europe during the war, right in the heart of the espionage battles that shaped history. Her job had been to observe and report, discreetly, and she had learned to trust her instincts above all. And right now, those instincts were screaming at her. The leader of the bikers, the man with the shaved head, was eyeing her house. She could feel it, even from her porch. Ethel straightened up, and with slow but steady steps, she crossed her front yard. The moment she reached the sidewalk, she saw the biker's eyes narrow as he turned toward her. "Hey, old lady," he called out, his voice mocking. "This isn't a playground, you know. You better get back inside before we make you." Ethel didn't flinch. She squared her shoulders and took a step forward, her cane tapping lightly against the pavement. Her heart was calm, her mind sharp. She had no intention of backing down. "Is that so?" Ethel asked, her voice as steady as ever. The biker leader laughed, his grin wide and malicious. "Yeah, that's so. You wouldn't want to get hurt, would you?" Ethel's eyes locked onto his. She had dealt with this kind of disrespect before, just never in her own neighborhood. With a calm that surprised even her, she pulled out her phone from her pocket. "I think I've had enough of your noise," she said. "You'll want to leave this place, and quickly." The biker's eyes flickered with doubt, but he was too proud to back off. "Or what, Granny? What are you going to do about it?" Ethel tapped a few buttons on her phone, her gaze never leaving his. "Let's just say I've got a few friends who will be very interested to hear what you're doing here," she said, her voice taking on an edge of steel. "And trust me, you don't want to mess with them." The biker paused for a moment, confusion spreading across his face as Ethel raised her phone to her ear. She didn't even wait for the line to connect. She already knew who would answer. "Hello, dear," Ethel said coolly as the phone rang. "Yes, there's a bit of a situation outside my house. Could you send someone to handle it? I think they've overstayed their welcome." She could almost hear her old friend's voice on the other end, his gruff, weathered tone. "Ethel? What's going on? Who's messing with you?" She lowered her voice, her words precise. "Just a group of bikers. They think they can intimidate an old woman. I'd like it if you could show them what happens when they pick the wrong person to mess with." There was a long pause. Then, the voice on the other end came back, calm and firm. "We'll be there in 10 minutes. Ethel hung up the phone and returned her attention to the bikers, who were now staring at her with a mix of confusion and hesitation. The leader of the pack took a step forward. "You really think a phone call's going to save you, old lady?" Ethel's eyes gleamed. "Not save me, dear, but it might save you some trouble." In the space of a few minutes, the situation began to escalate. Ethel stood her ground, her cane steady as she waited for the response. The bikers, unsure of what to do now that their intimidation tactic was failing, began to mutter amongst themselves. The leader of the group hesitated. He could see something in Ethel's eyes, a certain calm that was unnerving. Maybe it was the way she held herself. Maybe it was the fact that she had just made a call that seemed to have rattled him. But within moments, the sound of approaching vehicles broke the tension. 2 black SUVs appeared at the end of the street, their engines roaring like thunder. As they neared, the bikers began to look around nervously. The SUVs screeched to a halt, doors flinging open as men in dark suits stepped out, all wearing earpieces and scanning the surroundings with sharp eyes. They moved quickly, surrounding the bikers with precision that was too practiced to be anything but military. Ethel gave the biker leader one last look, her lips curling into a faint, knowing smile. "You really should have listened," she said softly. The leader took a step back. He didn't know who these people were, but he could feel the change in the air. This wasn't a neighborhood he could take over. Not with people like Ethel around. Within moments, the bikers were ushered into the SUVs, and the convoy pulled away, leaving the street quiet once again. Ethel stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle. Her heart rate was calm. She had done her part. The neighborhood was safe again. As she slowly turned back to her house, she pulled out her phone again, tapping a few more numbers. "Thanks for the help, dear. I'll see you at the next meeting, won't I?" And with that, Ethel Richards, 80 years old, returned to her peaceful life. Her neighborhood undisturbed once more. The next few days were eerily quiet in the neighborhood. The bikers were gone, and life returned to its usual rhythm. Ethel resumed her gardening, spent afternoons with her cats, and even took her daily walks to the local diner where she had her regular booth. But despite the return of normalcy, a lingering feeling gnawed at her. A feeling that there was something more to those bikers than she'd first thought. It wasn't just the noise. It was the fact that they had come with intent. And Ethel was no stranger to reading people. She knew their presence wasn't a random occurrence. Something was going on behind the scenes. She wasn't sure what yet, but her instincts told her it wasn't over. One afternoon, as Ethel was trimming her rose bushes in the garden, her neighbor Clara came rushing over, her face pale and anxious. "Ethel," Clara said, her voice trembling, "you've got to see this. I think the bikers are back." Ethel's heart skipped a beat. She stood up quickly, dusting the dirt from her gloves. "What do you mean, back? They were just taken out of here by my friends." I saw one of them," Clara said, pointing down the street. "He's standing by the fence, watching the house again. The same one, the leader." Ethel turned sharply, her sharp eyes scanning the street. Sure enough, she spotted the biker from the other day, standing near the edge of the fence, looking in her direction. The moment their eyes met, the man's face twisted into a dark grin, before he quickly turned and disappeared down the alley. Ethel's mind raced. This wasn't a casual encounter. This was a message. But what were they after? And why was he so confident they could just return? "I'll take care of it," Ethel said to Clara, her voice steady despite the rising tension in her chest. "You stay inside. I don't want you getting involved in this." Clara nodded, still looking worried, but didn't argue. She knew well enough that Ethel wasn't someone you crossed. After giving Clara a reassuring smile, Ethel walked toward the alley, her pace slow and deliberate. Her hand rested on her cane, but in her pocket was something far more lethal, her old service revolver, kept polished and loaded, just in case. She hadn't used it in years, but that didn't mean she didn't know how to handle it. And now, she was ready. As she turned the corner of the alley, she saw the leader of the bikers talking with a man in a suit, a man she didn't recognize. He was tall, with dark hair, wearing an expensive tailored jacket, and seemed to be giving orders. The biker nodded, his posture stiff, as if he was intimidated. Ethel paused, her breath steady. She had seen enough to understand that this wasn't a simple gang operation anymore. There was someone else pulling the strings. Someone much more dangerous. She had to move quickly. Taking a deep breath, she crept closer, staying low to the ground, her mind sharp. She had been in far more dangerous situations, and she trusted her training. Just as she was about to get closer for a better look, the man in the suit turned his head, his eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second. Ethel froze. The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes, the coldness of recognition, made her heart race. He knew she had seen him. In that split second, Ethel knew something else. The stakes were higher now. Ethel didn't wait to be spotted again. With a quick, calculated motion, she slipped back into the shadows of the alley, moving silently until she was several blocks away. Once she was safely back on her street, she dialed the number she knew so well. The phone rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Ethel? What's going on?" "Trouble," she said without hesitation. "They're back, and they've brought someone with them. A man in a suit. I don't know who he is, but he's not local. He's dangerous." There was a pause. "What do you want us to do about it?" "I need you to find out who he is. And don't be subtle about it. I think they've got something planned for this neighborhood. Whatever it is, I'm not going to let them take it." There was a long silence on the other end of the line, before the voice spoke again, more firmly now. "We'll handle it, Ethel. But don't do anything rash. We're sending someone to keep an eye on you." "I don't need a babysitter," Ethel snapped, a rare edge in her tone. "I've survived worse than this." The voice chuckled softly. Of course you have. But you can't take on a whole operation by yourself. Trust us. Ethel didn't reply. She trusted her instincts more than anyone, but she also knew when to accept help. If things were escalating to this level, she would need the support. The kind of support only her old colleagues could provide. As the phone call ended, she returned to her house, her mind spinning with possibilities. The bikers weren't just troublemakers. They were pawns in something bigger, and she was determined to figure out who was behind it all. The next few days were tense. Ethel kept a close watch on the street, noticing more unfamiliar faces lingering around. Clara was on edge, too, asking Ethel if she should contact the authorities, but Ethel refused. She had seen what happened when people depended on the police. Sometimes, you had to take matters into your own hands. On the fourth day, as dusk fell and the streetlights flickered to life, Ethel received the call she had been waiting for. "We know who he is," the voice on the other end said, more urgently than before. "The man in the suit? He's part of a private security firm, off the record, but heavily involved in covert operations. They've been hired by a corporation with a history of land grabs. They've got plans for your neighborhood, Ethel. They want this place for development. They're going to drive the residents out, and they think you're the only one standing in their way." Ethel felt a cold calm spread over her. This was it, the reason they were here. And it explained everything. The bikers, the man in the suit, the intimidation. "Well, I've been through worse," she said, her voice steady. "And I'm not about to let anyone take this neighborhood from us." With a newfound determination, she hung up the phone, ready to face whatever came next. The following morning, Ethel awoke to the familiar scent of coffee brewing and the soft chirp of birds outside her window. The calm was deceptive, though. The storm was coming. She could feel it in her bones. The plan was set. She wasn't going to wait for them to come to her anymore. It was time to make the first move. She spent the morning preparing, gathering everything she would need. Her old military bag, packed with the essentials, was tucked away under her bed. A few handguns, a couple of flashlights, a first aid kit, and of course, the revolver she'd carried through thick and thin. Her house, a modest two-story cottage with ivy creeping up the sides, had been her sanctuary for decades. It wasn't much in the grand scheme of things, but it was hers, and no one was going to take it from her. By noon, she had a plan. She wasn't going to wait for them to make the next move. She was going to confront them head-on. Ethel drove to a small cafe a few blocks away, where she'd arranged a secret meeting with an old contact, someone who could help her track down the corporate interests behind the private security firm. As she entered the cafe, she spotted him immediately, a wiry man with silver-streaked hair and a sharp suit. His name was Danny Holt, a former journalist who had spent years investigating corruption before disappearing from the public eye. Ethel trusted him because he was always 10 steps ahead of everyone else. He was sitting in the back corner, scanning the room with quiet intensity. When he saw her approach, he stood and gave her a small nod. "You look well," he said, his voice low and smooth. Ethel sat down without hesitation. "I'm not here for pleasantries. I need you to dig into a private security firm, Ravenstone Security. They're connected to a land grab, and I think they're behind the bikers who've been harassing my neighborhood." Danny didn't ask any questions. He just nodded and pulled out a tablet, quickly tapping on the screen. "Ravenstone, huh? They're a shadow operation. You won't find much on them through normal channels, but I've got some backdoor access." He leaned in, his fingers flying over the keys. "They've been involved in some major land development projects across the country, mostly using intimidation tactics, private militia, and sometimes straight-up force. I've heard rumors they've been working with local law enforcement in some areas to get rid of undesirable communities." Ethel leaned forward, her gaze fixed on the screen. "So, they're behind this?" "It looks like it," Danny confirmed, his brow furrowed. "But there's something odd here. Their operations seem to be linked to a corporation called Margot Enterprises. They've been buying up properties in your area, but they've been very careful about keeping a low profile. Too careful, in fact." Ethel's eyes narrowed. Margot Enterprises. She had heard that name whispered around town, but she hadn't connected it to the bikers or Ravenstone. Now it made sense. The corporation wanted her neighborhood for a reason. Do you think they'll try something today? She asked, her voice sharp. Danny hesitated for a moment, then looked around the cafe. I wouldn't put it past them, but it's not just the bikers we should worry about. They've got eyes everywhere, on the ground, in the police force, maybe even inside the local government. If they've decided to move on your neighborhood, they won't waste time. Ethel stood, her mind already working out the next steps. I'm not going to wait around for them to make the first move. I'm going to give them a reason to stay away. Danny reached out, his hand gently stopping her before she could leave. Ethel, don't go in guns blazing. You're not invincible. They'll have more firepower than you think. I've been outgunned before, she said, her voice low but firm. But I always get the job done. Danny sighed, clearly understanding that once Ethel made up her mind, there was no changing it. If you're determined, I'll get you some backup. I can't promise they'll be there in time, but I'll try. Ethel's eyes softened just for a moment. Thank you, Danny, but I'm used to fighting alone. With that, she left the cafe, her mind focused, her resolve steeled. She wasn't just fighting for her home. She was fighting for her community. And she wasn't about to let a bunch of corporate goons and their hired thugs destroy everything she'd spent a lifetime building. The sun was setting by the time Ethel made it back to her street. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and oppressive, as if the whole neighborhood knew something was coming but no one knew exactly when or how. She parked her car in the driveway, her eyes scanning the street. It was quiet, too quiet, but she knew that wouldn't last. As she stepped out of the car, she saw Clara standing by the front door, her hands wringing nervously. They're coming, aren't they? Clara asked, her voice shaky. Ethel gave her a reassuring smile, though her heart was racing. I don't know yet, but if they are, I'll be ready. The sound of engines revving cut through the silence. In the distance, Ethel saw the familiar motorcycles of the bikers approaching. But this time, there was something different. They weren't just riding aimlessly, they were organized, with a clear purpose. And at the head of the pack was the man in the suit, driving a sleek black car. Ethel felt the surge of adrenaline rush through her veins. This was it. She turned to Clara. Get inside. Lock the door. And don't open it for anyone. Clara hesitated but nodded, quickly disappearing into the house. Ethel's hand rested on the grip of her revolver, her eyes fixed on the approaching bikers. She wasn't just going to wait for them to make the first move. This was her neighborhood, and she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. As the bikers pulled up in front of her house, the leader stepped off his bike, a smirk on his face. Thought you could scare us off, old woman? Ethel stood tall, her voice steady. I don't scare easy, and I don't give up either. He stepped closer, and Ethel's hand tightened on the gun. But before she could draw it, a black SUV pulled up beside the group of bikers. Two men in suits stepped out, their expressions cold and calculating. The leader of the bikers turned to them, confusion flashing across his face. What the hell are you doing here? The taller of the two men spoke in a clipped, professional tone. This is our operation now. You're out. The leader of the bikers looked furious, but he didn't argue. He climbed back onto his bike, revved the engine, and sped off down the street, followed by the rest of the gang. Ethel watched in silence, her heart pounding. This was not the end. It was just the beginning. The corporation was stepping in, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. But Ethel was ready. She wasn't about to let anyone take her home. Not today, not ever. The next few days were a blur for Ethel. The events outside her house had been a warning, but the silence that followed was even more unnerving. Ravenstone's security had backed off for the moment, but Ethel knew it wouldn't last. The men in suits had made it clear that they weren't going to walk away quietly. She spent the next couple of days carefully watching the neighborhood, keeping a low profile but alert. She spent her afternoons going over old maps of the area, trying to understand why they wanted this land so badly. Her mind was piecing together bits and pieces of the puzzle. It was Clara who brought her the final piece. One evening, after dinner, Clara sat down beside Ethel, her expression more serious than usual. I've been doing some digging, she said, holding up a folder filled with papers. I found some old records about the land around here. And it's not just about real estate. There's something else going on. Ethel took the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. There were old property deeds, tax records, and what looked like development blueprints. But there was one thing that caught her attention immediately: a set of names, corporate names, connected to Margot Enterprises and Ravenstone Security. And right at the top of the list was a familiar name. Gordon Grayson, Ethel muttered under her breath. He was the CEO of Margot Enterprises, a man she had crossed paths with once before, years ago, when she was still active in her work. Grayson had been a businessman who dabbled in questionable practices, but he was careful to keep his hands clean. Until now, Clara continued, Grayson has been trying to secure land for a new development project. But it's not just any project. There's something underground here. Some kind of facility, or maybe something worse. Ethel's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what that meant. If they were building something in her neighborhood, something hidden away, it was only a matter of time before they would come for it. They weren't just after the land. They were after what was beneath it. I'll need more time, Clara said, breaking Ethel's thoughts. I'll go deeper into these records, find any connections between Grayson and Ravenstone. But we need to act fast. Ethel stood up, her mind already calculating her next move. Get what you can, and stay in touch. I'm going to pay a visit to Grayson. Clara looked alarmed. Ethel, that's dangerous. You can't just walk into his office. I know, Ethel said firmly, but it's the only way I'll get answers. I'll go in quietly. If I have to, I'll break in. Clara stood as well, her hands shaking. You're not going alone. I'll help. Ethel shook her head. No, this is something I have to do. You're staying here. If things go wrong, I'll need someone to finish what we started. Grayson's office was in a sleek, glass building in the heart of the city. The kind of place where businessmen made their deals in private, where the truth was hidden behind polished floors and smiling faces. Ethel arrived under the cover of darkness, her old black hoodie pulled tight against her frame. The city was quiet, the air cool and crisp. She took a deep breath, pushing all doubts and fears aside. This wasn't the first time she'd gone after someone like Grayson. She made her way to the back of the building, finding the maintenance door she had scoped out earlier. It was locked, but not difficult to break into with the right tools. Ethel had been carrying these kinds of tools for years. A few minutes of quiet work, and the door was open. Inside, the building was even quieter. Ethel moved through the corridors, her boots making no sound as she navigated the maze of hallways. She was looking for one specific office, Grayson's. But she knew she had to be careful. There were security cameras, and Ravenstone's men could be anywhere. It didn't take long to find the office. It was tucked away at the end of a long hallway, guarded by a large steel door. Ethel could hear muffled voices inside, speaking in low tones. She pressed herself against the wall, listening carefully. A voice that sounded like Grayson spoke up. I don't care how it's done, but we need it completed by the end of the month. If anyone gets in our way, we handle them. Ethel's heart raced. The deal was already in motion. She had to get inside and get the information she needed, before it was too late. She waited until the voices faded, then slipped inside the office. Grayson's desk was cluttered with papers, contracts, and a few scattered photographs. There was a computer, too, and Ethel wasted no time in turning it on, searching through the files with practiced speed. Her fingers froze when she found a digital map, one of the underground facility Grayson had been working on. The map was detailed, showing what looked like a highly secured area beneath the neighborhood. Ethel zoomed in, her mind racing. This wasn't just a development, it was a covert operation. Before she could dig deeper, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Someone was coming. Ethel quickly saved the files, shut down the computer, and ducked into a dark corner of the office. A moment later, the door swung open, and two men in black suits entered. One of them was carrying a file. Ethel pressed herself against the wall. Her breath held. The men talked briefly at the desk, and Ethel could feel her pulse quicken. They were going to leave any moment, and she needed to make her exit. With a swift motion, she slipped out the door, moving as quietly as she could. But she wasn't in the clear yet. As she turned the corner, she ran right into a security guard, his hand reaching for his gun. Ethel reacted instantly. She grabbed his wrist, twisting it, and sent him crashing into a filing cabinet. The guard was knocked unconscious, but she didn't have much time. She moved quickly, running through the halls, her mind focused on getting out. Finally, she reached the back door, her heart pounding in her chest. The night air felt like a breath of fresh air as she escaped the building. Back at her house, Ethel sat down at the kitchen table, the digital files spread out before her. The map of the underground facility, along with the files on Margot Enterprises and Ravenstone Security, painted a grim picture. Grayson wasn't just after land. He was after something much bigger, something hidden beneath her feet. And now, Ethel was the only one who could stop him. The weight of the files on Ethel's table felt heavier with each passing hour. She had learned a lot from her night at Grayson's office, but there were still many unanswered questions. What was so important about the underground facility? Why had Ravenstone Security been so involved? And how could she possibly take down a man like Gordon Grayson? She didn't have all the answers yet, but she knew she was running out of time. The facility was close to completion, and once it was operational, it would be nearly impossible to infiltrate. Ethel had always prided herself on her ability to stay one step ahead, but now she was in unfamiliar territory. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. Clara had been working tirelessly on her end, combing through records and trying to get more intel. After a long day of research, Clara came over to Ethel's house with some new information. "I found something," Clara said, breathless as she sat down at the table. "It's about the facility. It's not just a standard development. There's something being stored down there. Something dangerous." Ethel raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous? What do you mean?" Clara opened the folder she had brought, revealing a set of blueprints that were even more detailed than the ones Ethel had found. There was a section of the underground facility marked with a symbol Ethel didn't recognize, a series of numbers and codes that made no sense. "It's a containment area," Clara explained, her voice low. "Whatever's down there is being kept under lock and key, and I think I know why Grayson and Ravenstone are so interested in it. It's not just about money or land. It's about control. Whatever's in that facility, they intend to use it." Ethel's mind raced. She thought back to the files she had seen, the maps and diagrams of the facility. What could be so important that they were willing to go to these lengths to protect it? The answer was beginning to take shape in her mind, but she needed more. "We need to get inside," Ethel said, her tone firm. "We need to see for ourselves what's down there." Clara hesitated. "Ethel, we're not dealing with a simple operation anymore. These people are dangerous, and whatever's in that facility could be worse. You can't do this alone." Ethel met Clara's gaze, her resolve hardening. "I'm not asking you to come with me. I need you to stay here and keep an eye on Grayson. If anything happens, I need to know." Clara looked torn, but she finally nodded. "I'll do what I can. But be careful, Ethel. This is bigger than both of us." The night was Ethel's only ally as she made her way back to the construction site. The facility was located beneath the land that had once been a quiet industrial park on the outskirts of town, now the center of a major redevelopment. The area was still under heavy construction, but it had become eerily quiet since the contractors had started working for Grayson. Ethel had spent days watching the site, studying security patrols, and planning her route. Now, under the cover of darkness, she was ready to put her plan into action. She made her way to the back of the site, where a large fenced area was marked as a restricted zone. Security cameras dotted the perimeter, but she knew where they were. She had been watching them long enough to know the blind spots. Slipping past the fence with ease, she made her way toward the entrance of the underground facility. It was well hidden, accessible only by a set of service stairs that led down into the earth. There was a keypad beside the door, but Ethel had anticipated this. She had stolen a set of access codes from Grayson's office files, and they worked just as she had hoped. The door creaked open, and Ethel descended into the darkness below. The air was cold and heavy with the scent of concrete and dust. Her flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a vast concrete tunnel that stretched ahead. The walls were lined with security cameras, and a faint humming sound echoed in the distance. She moved quickly, staying in the shadows, careful not to alert the guards she knew were patrolling the area. As she made her way deeper into the facility, she finally arrived at the area marked on the blueprint as the containment zone. The door to the room was solid steel, with several locks securing it. This was it, the heart of the operation. Ethel took a deep breath and got to work. She used her tools to disable the locks, her hands moving with practiced ease. When the door finally opened, a flood of cold air rushed out, and Ethel's heart skipped a beat. Inside, the room was vast, filled with rows of large metal containers. Each one was labeled with a string of numbers and codes, but it was the contents that caught her attention. Each container was sealed tight, but there was something about the way they were stored, something that felt wrong. Ethel approached one of the containers, her curiosity getting the best of her. She carefully pried open the metal hatch, her fingers trembling with anticipation. What she found inside nearly knocked her off her feet. The container held what appeared to be a series of vials, each one filled with a strange, glowing substance. The vials were carefully arranged in rows, and there was a note attached to one of the containers. Ethel read it aloud to herself. Subject: ST-97. Containment required. Immediate use authorized. Ethel's mind raced as she pieced the information together. These weren't just chemicals, these were biological agents. And Grayson and Ravenstone weren't just planning a real estate development. They were creating something dangerous, something that could change everything. She quickly took a picture of the vials and the note, knowing that she had to get out of there before anyone realized she was inside. But as she turned to leave, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Ethel's pulse quickened. The footsteps grew louder, echoing in the empty hall of the facility. She froze, her body pressed against the cold, concrete wall. A guard's silhouette appeared in the hallway, moving toward the containment zone. Ethel held her breath, her eyes scanning the room for an escape. The shadows worked in her favor. The guard passed by the entrance of the containment area without noticing her, his attention elsewhere. Ethel quickly moved to the back of the room, ducking behind one of the large containers. She waited, tense, for several long minutes until the footsteps faded into the distance. She allowed herself a quiet exhale, but the danger wasn't over yet. Grayson's security was tight, and she needed to move fast. She carefully closed the container she had opened and took one last look around. The glowing vials, whatever they were, had to be the key to everything. But now, her main focus was getting out of the facility undetected. Ethel retraced her steps, carefully navigating the hallways. She passed through the storage area where the containers were held, and as she reached the staircase leading back up to the surface, she paused. A flash of movement in the distance caught her eye. A second guard. This one was closer, and there was no way to avoid being seen. Ethel's mind raced. She couldn't afford to be caught. Not now. Not when she was so close to understanding what Grayson was planning. She needed a distraction. Her eyes darted around, landing on an old metal cart near the stairwell. It was filled with equipment and supplies, likely left behind by the workers earlier in the day. She quickly grabbed a wrench from the cart and hurled it toward the far corner of the hallway, making sure the noise would draw the guard's attention away from her. The clatter echoed down the corridor, and the guard instantly turned, moving toward the source of the sound. Ethel didn't hesitate. She slipped past him, up the staircase, and into the fresh air of the night. Back at her house, Ethel reviewed the photos she had taken in the facility. The vials, the codes, the notes, everything pointed to one conclusion. Whatever Grayson and Ravenstone were working on wasn't just dangerous, it was highly controlled. The substance in those vials could be a weapon, or worse, a biological experiment. She couldn't be certain yet, but she had the feeling that the facility was a front for something far more sinister than anyone had realized. Clara had been waiting anxiously when Ethel returned. The older woman was pacing the living room, a look of concern on her face. "Did you find anything?" Clara asked, her voice tight. Ethel nodded, holding up the photo of the vials. "I don't know what's in them yet, but whatever it is, it's not just chemicals. It's a weapon, or a virus. Something Grayson and Ravenstone want to keep hidden." Clara took the photo from Ethel's hands, her brow furrowed as she examined it closely. "This is big, Ethel. Whatever's in those vials could be the key to everything. We have to find out who else is involved in this, and fast." Ethel nodded, her eyes steely with determination. "I'm going back tomorrow. I need more answers, and I'm not going to stop until I get them. But this time, we'll need to bring in someone who can help." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Ethel hesitated, considering her options. She needed someone with the right skills, someone who knew how to handle situations like this. Then it came to her. "I know a man," Ethel said quietly, "a former colleague of mine. He owes me a favor." Clara gave her a knowing look. "Is he trustworthy?" Ethel gave a small, wry smile. "He's not perfect, but he's the best I know for this kind of thing." The next day, Ethel made her way to an old, nondescript warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, the air smelled of grease and oil, and the sound of tools clinking echoed through the cavernous space. In the far corner, a man was hunched over a workbench, his back to the door. He didn't turn when Ethel entered, but she didn't need to announce herself. The man knew exactly who she was. "Ethel," he said without looking up. "I wondered when you'd come back around." She walked up to him, her footsteps light but steady. "I need your help, Charlie. There's something big going down, and I'm going to need someone with your skills to get me inside." Charlie straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. He was a rugged man, built for this kind of work. Surveillance, hacking, anything that required a sharp mind and a steady hand. Ethel had worked with him before, back when they were both in the business of uncovering secrets. "You know I don't do things for free," Charlie said, his voice low and gravelly. Ethel handed him a folder full of documents. "You know I'm good for it. This is bigger than both of us. If we don't stop Grayson now, we could all be in danger." Charlie eyed the folder, then gave her a long, assessing look. "I'll help you, but you'll owe me. Big time." Ethel nodded. "Agreed. Let's get started." Ethel and Charlie sat in the dimly lit corner of the warehouse, surrounded by computers and outdated surveillance equipment. Charlie had set up a few screens and was already deep into his work, analyzing data from the photos Ethel had taken at the facility. She watched him closely, admiring the way he worked. The man had a talent for finding the cracks in systems, the hidden vulnerabilities that most people overlooked. "Okay," Charlie muttered, clicking through a series of encrypted files. "I think I've got something." Grayson's facility isn't just a research lab. It's a testing ground for something called Project Helix. Ethel's heart skipped a beat. "Project Helix?" Charlie nodded, eyes glued to the screen. "It's all buried in here. Grayson and Ravenstone are conducting human trials, experiments. The vials you saw? They're the serum that's being injected into test subjects. And from what I can tell, it's altering their genetic makeup." Ethel's mind raced. "You're saying they're using people as guinea pigs? But why? What's the endgame?" Charlie leaned back in his chair, his fingers running through his scruffy beard. "That's the million-dollar question. But one thing's clear. They're not just trying to create a weapon. They're trying to create something new. Something more powerful, more controllable. This could change everything." Ethel felt a cold chill run down her spine. "We need to stop them." Charlie looked up at her, his expression serious. "We will. But we need more than just pictures and documents. We need hard evidence. We need to get inside that facility again and find out exactly what's going on in those labs." Ethel nodded. "I'll go in again, but we're going to need a plan. We can't afford to get caught." Charlie pulled out a blueprint of the facility he'd hacked from Grayson's servers. "I've got the layout. There's a ventilation shaft near the back of the building that leads straight into the lab area. It's not on the usual security cameras, so if we time it right, we can sneak in undetected." Ethel studied the blueprint carefully. "Okay, I'll go in through the vents. You keep an eye on the security feed and guide me through." Charlie smirked. "You really know how to get me to work, don't you?" Ethel grinned. "You wouldn't be here if I didn't." Charlie's fingers moved quickly over his keyboard, unlocking a series of live feeds. "I've got access to the cameras now. It's just a matter of timing. I'll tell you when the guards are clearing out of certain areas, and you'll be able to make your move." Ethel felt a surge of confidence. It wasn't the first time she'd snuck into a high-security building, but it was the most dangerous. If they were caught now, it would be over for both of them. The night air was thick with tension as Ethel approached the facility once more. Her heart thudded in her chest as she glanced up at the tall, foreboding building. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far worse than she'd imagined. If Project Helix was what Charlie had uncovered, then they were dealing with something that could change the world, or destroy it. The perimeter was as heavily guarded as before, but this time, Ethel had the advantage of knowing where the blind spots were. She slipped past the main gates, her footsteps light on the gravel, and made her way to the back of the building where the ventilation shaft was located. Charlie's voice crackled in her earpiece. "You're almost there. The guard in the east hallway just passed by the shaft. You've got about 5 minutes before he makes his rounds again." Ethel took a deep breath, then unscrewed the grate of the ventilation shaft. She crawled inside, the small, cramped space feeling more like a tomb than a route to salvation. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old machinery, but she pushed forward, using the map in her mind to guide her. As she made her way through the narrow ducts, the sound of Charlie's voice was a reassuring constant in her ear. "You're almost there. The lab is just up ahead. Be careful, Ethel. The cameras will be on high alert now. If you're seen, we're both done." Ethel nodded, though Charlie couldn't see her. She had no intention of getting caught. The duct ended near a small hatch, just outside the main laboratory. She could hear voices on the other side, 2 guards, chatting casually. Ethel waited, timing her movements as best as she could. When they turned their backs, she quietly opened the hatch and slipped inside the lab. Inside the lab, the air was cold and sterile. The bright fluorescent lights flickered above, casting a harsh glow on the white tiles and stainless steel counters. The room was lined with high-tech equipment, and in the center, several glass chambers housed unconscious test subjects, men and women, their bodies connected to machines monitoring their vitals. Ethel's stomach turned. She had seen many things in her life, but this was different. These were human beings, their lives stolen from them for some twisted experiment. She carefully moved through the room, taking pictures of the equipment and the test subjects. The files Charlie had uncovered suggested that the serum was altering their DNA, but there was no telling what the long-term effects would be. If Grayson succeeded in perfecting Project Helix, he could control a generation of people, all with enhanced abilities and loyalty to him alone. She had to get the evidence and get out. Ethel approached one of the workstations, carefully sifting through the papers. Her fingers brushed against a folder marked "Confidential." She slid it out, scanning its contents quickly. The words that jumped out at her were chilling. Helix Serum, Phase 2, Field Testing. Her pulse quickened. They were testing the serum on live subjects, and it was clear they were nearing completion. Once Phase 2 was finished, there would be no stopping Grayson. Ethel's heart raced as she tucked the folder into her bag. Her fingers trembled with a mixture of adrenaline and disgust. She had what she needed, but the mission wasn't over. She had to get out of the lab undetected, and every minute spent here increased the chances of being caught. As she turned to leave, she heard footsteps approaching. Panic surged through her chest. She ducked behind a row of machines, her breath shallow as she tried to steady herself. The voices grew louder, echoing through the sterile hall. "Where's the backup on that last batch?" one of the guards said, his tone gruff. "We need the data to make sure it's working for the next test." "Should be ready soon," the second guard replied. "Just waiting on the serum results from upstairs." Ethel held her breath. If they came into the lab now, it would be game over. She waited, listening intently, hoping they wouldn't turn in her direction. The footsteps faded as the guards walked past the door. Ethel exhaled in relief. She quickly darted for the hatch, glancing at the time. Charlie would be waiting for her signal. They had planned everything out, but now it was up to her to make it back safely. Charlie's voice crackled in her ear again. "I've got the guards moving in on your location. You need to move now." Ethel was already halfway to the ventilation shaft when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching from behind. She cursed under her breath. She wasn't going to make it in time. She reached the hatch and pushed it open, but before she could climb inside, a shout echoed through the hallway. "Stop right there." Ethel froze. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she turned slowly, facing the 2 guards who had just entered the lab. They were young, but their faces were hardened by the kind of work they did, the kind of work that kept them alive in a place like this. "Who are you?" one of them demanded, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. "How did you get in here?" Ethel's mind raced. She had seconds, maybe less, to come up with something, anything, to get out of this. I'm just a janitor," she said, forcing her voice to sound calm and steady. "I was told to clean the lab." I must have taken the wrong turn. The guards exchanged a glance, clearly skeptical, but Ethel could see them hesitate. They had no idea who she was or why she was there, but they also knew that things in this place weren't always as they seemed. Turn around, the second guard said. We need to check your ID. Before she could react, Ethel dropped low, swinging the folder in her hand and slamming it into the guard's face with all her strength. He staggered back, stunned, and she took the opportunity to strike. With a quick, practiced movement, she disarmed him and twisted his arm behind his back, pinning him to the ground. The first guard lunged at her, but Ethel was faster. She kicked him hard in the chest, sending him sprawling backward. She grabbed the stun gun from his belt and aimed it at the second guard, firing just as he reached for his weapon. He dropped to the ground with a thud, incapacitated. She didn't have time to waste. She grabbed the folder again and bolted for the ventilation shaft, sliding inside just as the door to the lab opened again. The noise from the confrontation had triggered a security alarm, and she knew that more guards would be on their way soon. Ethel crawled through the ducts, her mind spinning. The plan had been simple: get the evidence, get out, but now it was more complicated than she had imagined. Grayson wasn't just building a dangerous serum. He was building an army, and if they didn't stop him now, the world would never be the same. By the time Ethel made it back to the warehouse, Charlie was already waiting, his face tense. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for any signs of injury. Ethel nodded, though her heart was still racing. "I've got the evidence," she said, pulling the folder from her bag and tossing it onto the table. "And it's worse than we thought. Project Helix isn't just about creating super soldiers. It's about creating something new, something they can control." Charlie flipped open the folder, scanning through the documents. "This is bad. Really bad. If they finish this, they'll have an army of genetically enhanced soldiers, all under their control. And if this goes public, it could start a war." Ethel's gaze hardened. "We're going to stop them before they can finish it." Charlie looked at her, his expression serious. "We'll need more than just the documents. We need to go after Grayson, get him to tell us everything." Ethel thought for a moment. Grayson was dangerous, but so was the serum he was creating. If they didn't put an end to it now, there might not be another chance. "We'll get him," she said, determination in her voice. "But we're going to need help. And we're going to need a plan that takes them all down, not just Grayson." Charlie grinned. "That's why you're the one calling the shots. Let's do this." Ethel nodded. "Let's bring it all down." Ethel and Charlie spent the next few hours strategizing. The warehouse was eerily quiet, the only sound being the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The urgency of the situation weighed heavily on them both, but neither of them showed signs of faltering. They had come this far, and now they had to see it through to the end. Ethel tapped her fingers on the edge of the table, deep in thought. "We need to get Grayson. We can't risk him disappearing, or worse, launching his serum into the world before we can stop him." Charlie leaned forward, his brow furrowed. "How do we get to him, though? He's too well protected. There's no way we'll get through the front lines." Ethel took a deep breath. "We'll need to go in undercover. Grayson's been operating out of a facility in the outskirts of the city. We'll infiltrate it, find him, and force him to give us the full scope of his operation. If he's got the resources to create an army, we'll use those resources against him." Charlie nodded. "I've got some contacts who can help us with equipment, but we'll need to move fast. There's no telling how long it'll be before he realizes someone's on his tail." "We can't waste any more time," Ethel said. "We need to strike before he does." They spent the next few hours preparing, assembling weapons, mapping out the facility, and coordinating with the few trusted allies they had. Ethel's mind raced as she considered every possibility: Grayson's guards, security systems, and any other surprises he might have in store. She wasn't just going in to capture him. She was going in to destroy everything he'd worked to create. As night fell, the small team assembled outside the facility. It was an old, heavily guarded compound, surrounded by a series of high fences topped with barbed wire. The flickering lights of the security cameras seemed to track their every movement. But Ethel wasn't worried. They had planned for this. Charlie handed her a set of night vision goggles. "This should help with the cameras. We'll be in and out before they know what hit them." Ethel took the goggles and nodded. She could feel the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders, but she pushed it aside. They had one chance to end this. The team moved swiftly, using the cover of darkness to their advantage. Ethel led the way, her focus razor-sharp as she scanned for security patrols. The compound was silent, save for the occasional hum of machinery and the far-off sound of a guard's footsteps. They reached the outer wall without incident and quickly scaled the fence. Inside, the layout of the compound was a maze of hallways and steel doors. Ethel's heart pounded in her chest as they moved deeper into the facility, every footstep carefully timed. They reached a control room at the far end of the hall, where Ethel accessed the security feeds. The guards were on high alert, but they hadn't detected the intruders yet. Ethel's fingers flew over the keyboard, disabling the alarms and looping the cameras. For now, they had a window of opportunity. "We've got about 10 minutes before someone realizes something's wrong," Ethel said, her voice low. "Let's move." Ethel's team navigated the inner halls with precision, bypassing locked doors and taking down anyone who stood in their way. They moved like shadows, a blend of speed and stealth. Ethel led them through a maze of sterile rooms, each more ominous than the last. As they neared the lab, Ethel's stomach twisted with anticipation. This was it. The door to the lab slid open with a soft hiss, revealing the darkened interior. Ethel's eyes scanned the room quickly. There, in the center, stood a series of containment pods. Each one held a person, test subjects. The serum was working, but it was still in its early stages. Ethel had to destroy this and everything connected to it before it could progress further. "Grayson's not far," she whispered to Charlie, who was now at her side. "We take him alive, but we don't hesitate if he tries to make a move." They moved through the lab, avoiding the central section where the active tests were being conducted. Ethel's thoughts were consumed with one goal: find Grayson, get the intel, and bring this madness to an end. They rounded a corner and saw him, Dr. Grayson, standing in front of a terminal, his back to them. He didn't see them coming. Ethel's voice was steady, though her hands gripped her weapon tightly. "Grayson, it's over." He turned slowly, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "You think you've won? You think you can stop me? You have no idea what I'm capable of." "I know exactly what you're capable of," Ethel said, stepping forward. "But it's not going to happen. Not this time." Grayson's eyes flashed with anger. He reached for a button on his desk, but Charlie was faster. In a blur, he shot out, grabbing Grayson by the wrist and twisting his arm behind his back. "Not so fast," Charlie growled. Grayson laughed darkly, struggling in Charlie's grip. "You're too late. The serum's already out of the test phase. It's already being distributed." Ethel's blood ran cold. "What do you mean, distributed?" Grayson's grin widened. "You'll see soon enough. By the time you figure it out, it'll be too late. My soldiers will be everywhere." Ethel's heart skipped a beat. The worst-case scenario was unfolding. But they weren't finished yet. "Not if I can help it," Ethel said, stepping forward. "Where is it? Where is the distribution center?" Grayson hesitated, then sneered. "You think I'm going to tell you? You're wasting your time." With a swift motion, Ethel raised her weapon. "Tell me, or you won't be alive to see your army take over." Grayson stared at her, considering his options. He knew he was beaten. Finally, he spoke, his voice laced with venom. "You think this is over? It's just beginning." Ethel's eyes narrowed. "Tell me where." Grayson hesitated, but Ethel could see the conflict in his eyes. He knew the game was up, but his ego wouldn't let him give in without a fight. Ethel's grip tightened on her weapon, and she leaned in closer, her voice icy. "You can make this easy, or you can make it harder. Where's the distribution center?" Grayson finally broke. His expression twisted into a mixture of fury and resignation as he muttered, "You'll never stop it. It's already started. They're already out there." Ethel's heart raced. "Where, Grayson?" "Now." He gave her a crooked smile. "It's in the old warehouse district, down by the docks. You won't make it in time to stop them. You'll all be too late." Ethel exchanged a glance with Charlie. There was no time to waste. They had to move now. The team moved fast, their mission now clear. reach the distribution center before Grayson's plan could unfold fully. Ethel's mind raced as they navigated their way through the compound, with Grayson in tow, a prisoner now. The old warehouse district loomed in the distance, a labyrinth of decaying buildings and rusted shipping containers. The docks were a perfect place to hide operations like this, forgotten by most, overlooked by the authorities. But not by Ethel. They arrived in record time, pulling up near an abandoned shipping yard. The air was thick with tension, and the sound of distant waves crashing against the docks felt almost ominous. The distribution center wasn't far now. "Stay sharp," Ethel warned, motioning for the team to fan out. They moved cautiously through the shadows, the echoes of their footsteps swallowed by the empty space. Ethel's gut told her they were close, but it wasn't until they reached a massive steel door that they knew they'd found it. "Ready?" Charlie asked, his hand on the door handle. Ethel nodded, her pulse racing. "Let's go." The door creaked open with a harsh metallic groan, revealing a cavernous space filled with rows of crates and equipment. But what caught their attention wasn't the cargo. It was the men. Dozens of armed soldiers, wearing dark uniforms, were scattered throughout the room, moving efficiently, unloading weapons, and preparing for something big. Ethel's blood ran cold. Grayson's serum wasn't just being distributed. It was being used to arm an army. "They're already starting," Charlie murmured under his breath. Ethel glanced at Grayson, who was standing a few steps behind them, his smug smile still in place. "You knew they'd be here," Ethel said, her voice like ice. "But why? What's the real endgame?" Grayson met her gaze, unfazed. "You're too late to stop it. This isn't just about soldiers. This is about control, about reshaping the world. And you can't stop it." Before Ethel could respond, one of the soldiers spotted them, his eyes widening in alarm. The next moment, alarms blared, and gunfire erupted from all sides. The mission had just turned into a fight for survival. Ethel ducked behind a stack of crates as bullets whizzed past. "Move, move," she shouted to her team. They scattered, using the crates for cover, firing back as they went. Charlie and the others laid down suppressive fire, but Ethel's focus was on Grayson. She needed answers, fast. She couldn't let him escape, not now when they were so close. She rushed toward him, catching a glimpse of his retreating form as he dashed toward an elevator at the far end of the warehouse. "Grayson!" she shouted, but he didn't stop. He reached the elevator and pressed the button, disappearing into the depths below the warehouse. Ethel didn't hesitate. She sprinted toward the elevator, her heart pounding in her chest. If Grayson made it out, everything they had worked for would be for nothing. Charlie was at her side in an instant. "We can't let him go. Not now." They reached the elevator just as the doors began to close. Ethel slammed her hand against the control panel, but the doors didn't open. Grayson had sealed himself inside. "Get us down there," she ordered. "We can't lose him." The two of them pulled back, moving swiftly to find another entrance to the lower levels. Ethel's mind was a whirl of calculations. There was no time to lose. Grayson was going to make his final move, and it was up to her to stop him before it was too late. The lower level was a maze of dark, metallic corridors. Ethel and Charlie crept through the hallways, listening for any signs of movement. They were getting closer. She could feel it. Grayson was just ahead, but the closer they got, the more dangerous it became. The sound of footsteps echoed through the corridor, and then a voice, cold and distant. "You should have stayed away, Ethel. You think you can stop me? You're just an old woman playing a game she doesn't understand." Ethel's eyes narrowed. Grayson's voice was laced with a bitter laugh. She had heard enough. "We're done here, Grayson," she said, stepping into view. "This is the end of the line." Grayson appeared from the shadows, his expression one of disdain. "You think you can stop this?" he asked, as if the question itself was absurd. "The serum's already out there. My army is already on the move. You're too late." "We'll see about that," Ethel shot back. Before Grayson could respond, Charlie moved in, launching himself at the man. But Grayson was quick, pulling out a concealed weapon and aiming it directly at Charlie. "Not so fast," Grayson sneered, his finger tightening on the trigger. Ethel's heart skipped a beat, but she acted without thinking. In one swift motion, She aimed and fired, hitting Grayson's hand with pinpoint accuracy. His weapon fell to the ground with a clatter. "I don't think so," she said, stepping forward. "You've lost." Grayson glared at her, but the fight was gone from his eyes. He knew it. It was over. Grayson sank to his knees, his hand cradling the spot where he had been shot. The smugness that had defined him was gone, replaced by a grim realization that his plan was crumbling. He looked up at Ethel, his eyes narrowing with both hatred and disbelief. "You think you've won," he spat, blood trickling from his mouth. "You're nothing but an old woman who's too stubborn to quit. You can't stop what's already begun. My people are in motion. The serum, it's already spreading." Ethel stood over him, unflinching, her eyes cold. She had seen enough of his kind in her time. Men who thought their schemes were infallible, who believed that power could never be taken from them. Grayson was no different. But now, he was nothing more than a broken man. "You've been lying to yourself," Ethel said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "You've been so focused on control, you never stopped to realize that you can't control everything." Grayson sneered but said nothing more. Charlie, still recovering from his near miss, moved closer, his face hardened. "We need to get him out of here. The authorities will take it from here." Ethel nodded, taking one last look at Grayson before turning to leave. She could feel the weight of the mission bearing down on her. They had stopped the worst of it, but the battle wasn't over. Not yet. As they moved toward the exit, Ethel's thoughts raced. There were still pieces to the puzzle that hadn't been solved. The serum was out there. Grayson had mentioned it was spreading. They didn't know who else had been involved, who else might be working behind the scenes. They had won this battle, but the war wasn't over. The next few days were a blur. Grayson was taken into custody, but Ethel couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. The authorities were busy gathering evidence, interrogating Grayson, and trying to piece together his connections. Yet, despite the success, Ethel knew there was still a bigger threat looming. She sat in her office, reviewing the intel they had gathered. Charlie sat across from her, a cup of coffee in his hand, his gaze intense. "I don't like this," he said, breaking the silence. "Grayson's the tip of the iceberg. He was just a pawn, Ethel. There's something bigger going on, and I don't think we've even scratched the surface." Ethel nodded, staring out the window. "I know. The serum, it's not just about creating an army. Grayson's rhetoric, what he said about reshaping the world. It's like he thought he could control something much bigger than just a military force." Charlie frowned. "What do you mean?" "There's a purpose to everything he's done. The serum, the army, the attacks on key places, it's all leading to something. But what?" Ethel stood up, pacing the room. She had seen enough to know that this wasn't just about power. It was about changing the world itself, about reordering society in a way that couldn't be undone. "We need to dig deeper," she said, determination in her voice. "We need to find out who's backing him and what they want." Charlie stood up, his expression hardening. "Then let's get to work." Ethel's team moved swiftly in the days that followed, tracing Grayson's contacts, pulling apart every lead. The network he had built was vast, stretching across multiple countries, and it was clear now that it wasn't just one rogue agent at work. There was a powerful organization behind the serum, one that had been laying the groundwork for years. It took them a week to track down the next key player in the operation, a financier operating out of an old estate on the outskirts of the city. This was the man who had funded Grayson's entire project. When Ethel and her team arrived at the estate, it was already dark. The wind howled through the trees, and the mansion loomed ominously against the night sky. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. "We go in hard," Ethel said, her voice low. "No hesitation. This ends tonight." They moved into position, surrounding the estate with military precision. The mansion was heavily guarded, but with the element of surprise on their side, they breached the perimeter. Inside, they found an operation far bigger than they had imagined. The financier, a man named Roland Graves, was sitting at a desk in his study, surrounded by documents and files. He barely flinched when they entered. "You should have stayed out of this, Ethel," Graves said, his voice eerily calm. "You have no idea what you're dealing with." Ethel advanced toward him, her weapon steady. "We know enough." Graves chuckled darkly, standing up from his desk. Do you? The serum is only the beginning. You've stopped one man, but you'll never stop the revolution that's coming. Ethel's eyes narrowed. What revolution? Graves' smile widened, and for a moment, Ethel thought she saw a flicker of madness in his eyes. You'll see soon enough. There's more than one way to change the world, Ethel, and it's already in motion. The silence in the study was heavy as Roland Graves stood before Ethel and her team, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Ethel's mind raced as she tried to piece together the pieces of this twisted puzzle. The serum, the violence, the chaos. It all pointed to a singular goal. But what was it? What revolution was Graves speaking of? We've already stopped Grayson, Ethel said, her voice steady despite the tension. It's over. You've lost. Graves shook his head slowly, as if she were a child who couldn't see the bigger picture. You have no idea how deep this goes. You've only scratched the surface. With a flick of his hand, he gestured to the walls around him, where screens flickered with images of people, cities, and operations. You think stopping a few key players will end this? There are hundreds, thousands of us, all working toward the same goal. The world is corrupt, Ethel. It's broken, and we have the power to fix it. Ethel's heart sank. She had known there were deeper layers to this conspiracy, but hearing it out loud was a bitter confirmation. They weren't just dealing with a criminal syndicate or a rogue military faction. They were facing an ideological movement, one that believed the world could only be saved through destruction and total control. You think you can control chaos? Ethel's voice was sharp. You think you can build something better by tearing everything down? You're delusional. Graves smiled, a cold, calculating smile. You'll see, Ethel. Soon, the whole world will understand. He turned toward the desk, pressing a button hidden beneath the surface. Suddenly, the room was filled with a low hum, and the screens flickered faster, displaying an array of maps, codes, and encrypted messages. It took only a moment for Ethel to realize what was happening. They've activated it, she muttered under her breath. The hum grew louder, the air in the room thick with tension. Graves stood motionless, his eyes gleaming with anticipation. The revolution has already begun. Every major city is on a countdown. We've placed the serum in the water supply. It's unstoppable now. In less than 24 hours, the world will change. Ethel's stomach churned as she quickly processed the implications. The serum wasn't just an army. It was a weapon. It was meant to infect millions, turning them into puppets of this organization, all under the guise of saving humanity. And with it, they would bring about a new world order, one built on fear, control, and conformity. Deactivate it now, Ethel demanded, her voice low and dangerous. You still have a chance to save yourself, Roland. Graves chuckled, the sound grating. You really think I'm the one who needs saving? You're too late. It's already in motion. We're beyond turning back now. Charlie stepped forward, his eyes scanning the monitors. We can stop this. There's got to be a way to reverse it. Ethel shook her head. No time. We have to find the main server, the central control. That's where we can shut it down. Graves' eyes darkened, his fingers hovering over the controls. You'll never get there in time. I've set up defenses. You're trapped. Suddenly, the room was flooded with armed guards, pouring in from hidden doors and secret passageways. Ethel's team quickly drew weapons, but the odds were shifting in Graves' favor. Get out of here, Ethel barked to Charlie. I'll hold them off. Charlie hesitated but knew the stakes. I'm not leaving you. You have to, she shouted. This is bigger than me. Go. Reluctantly, Charlie and the others started to retreat, moving quickly through a hidden exit Ethel had noticed earlier. But before they could fully escape, Ethel found herself face to face with Roland Graves, who now stood in her path. You think you're the hero here? Graves said, stepping closer. You're just one old woman, trying to play in a game you can't even begin to understand. Ethel didn't flinch. I've lived through enough to know what real change looks like, and it doesn't come from bloodshed and lies. Graves sneered, then pressed a button on his desk. The ground rumbled beneath them, and the screens filled with urgent red warning lights. Game over, he said, his voice low and menacing. We've won. The countdown clock was ticking, and Ethel knew that every second counted. She moved quickly, pulling her team to safety as they worked to disable the virus spreading through the servers. But with Graves having activated the last line of defense, it was a race against time, and the walls were closing in fast. "Ethel, we don't have much time," Charlie shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "We need to get to the server room now." She nodded, rallying the team as they pushed through the estate's corridors, each step bringing them closer to the heart of Graves' operation. The noise in the mansion was deafening, alarms blaring and lights flashing in erratic patterns. As they reached the server room, Ethel's eyes scanned the room, taking in the rows of high-tech equipment, humming with activity. She moved to the console, rapidly inputting commands to bypass the encryption Graves had set up. But then, a voice interrupted her. "You're too late." Ethel froze. Graves was standing in the doorway, flanked by armed guards. His face was twisted in triumph. "You've got seconds before the world changes forever. The serum is in the air. It's in the water. It's in everything." Ethel took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She wasn't going to let him win. With a swift movement, she knocked the nearest guard to the ground, then turned to Charlie. "Get the main override system ready. I'll keep him busy." Charlie nodded, setting to work at the terminal as Ethel faced Graves one last time. "It's over, Roland," Ethel said, her voice steady. "No matter what you've done, no matter how many people you've controlled, there's always a way to stop it." Graves smirked. "You think you can beat us? You think you can fight against this system we've built?" Ethel didn't answer. Instead, she pulled the trigger on a hidden weapon she'd kept for just such an occasion. A dart flew across the room, striking Graves in the neck. The smug look on his face vanished as the serum coursed through him. His eyes widened in realization. "No, no." Graves gasped, stumbling back, his body convulsing. "You can't stop it." But it was too late. The revolution he had tried to start, his twisted vision of control, was coming to an end. The air was thick with tension as Ethel and her team stood over the collapsed form of Roland Graves. The room fell silent, save for the faint hum of the server equipment and the countdown timer, now frozen. "We did it," Charlie said, his voice a mixture of relief and disbelief. Ethel nodded, her heart still racing. For now. But even as the crisis was averted, Ethel knew that this wasn't the end. The forces behind Graves, the organization that had funded him, were still out there. They still had a plan, one that would eventually rise again. But for the first time in days, Ethel allowed herself a breath of relief. They had one. For now. And they would keep fighting until the war was truly over. Ethel sat quietly in the back of the van as they made their way out of the estate. The wind rushed past the cracked windows, and the faint glow of city lights illuminated the darkened streets. Her mind kept drifting back to Graves' last words, the ones that hinted at something more, a larger, more insidious network stretching far beyond the mansion. She had stopped one man, but the war wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Charlie, seated next to her, noticed the distant look in her eyes. "You're thinking about the next fight, aren't you?" Ethel didn't need to answer. It was obvious. They had faced countless battles, but this time, something felt different. Something about the way Graves had spoken, the certainty in his voice, told her that they had barely scratched the surface of the enemy's true reach. "It's not over yet," Ethel said, finally breaking the silence. "Graves might be down, but there's a whole system behind him. We've seen it. The serum, the people he's connected to. They won't just let this go." Charlie nodded, his fingers drumming on the dashboard. "I know. We've got some breathing room, but we're still not safe. They'll come for us." Ethel sighed, her fingers tightening around the worn handle of her bag. "We'll keep moving. Keep pushing. It's the only way." The rest of the team was silent, each one lost in their thoughts, the weight of what had just happened pressing on them. They had managed to escape with their lives and destroyed Graves' plans, but the shadow of the next threat loomed large. By the time they reached their safe house, the weight of the day had started to take its toll. Ethel's body ached, her mind was exhausted, and yet she couldn't allow herself the luxury of rest. Not yet. They had to regroup, find new allies, and most importantly, Stay one step ahead of the organization that would surely come after them. Let's get to work, Ethel said as they entered the safe house. It was a nondescript building in the outskirts of the city, hidden from prying eyes. A place where they could lick their wounds and plan their next move. The team set up quickly, pulling up data on their latest victory. They analyzed the encrypted messages they had captured from Graves' mansion, looking for any hint of the larger network that still operated in the shadows. Charlie worked alongside Ethel, trying to trace the connections between Graves and the mysterious benefactors who had backed him. They found mention of several cities, places where the serum had been distributed and where other cells of the organization were already active. It was clear now. This wasn't a rogue operation. This was a global movement, and it had only just begun. We need to hit them before they can regroup, Charlie said, his voice tense. If we wait too long, they'll be ready for us. Ethel's mind was racing. We need more information. We can't just strike blindly. We have to know where they'll be weakest. Just then, the door to the safe house creaked open, and a familiar face appeared in the doorway. Couldn't stay away, huh? Ethel said, offering a wry smile. The newcomer stepped inside, a tall man with sharp features and an air of quiet confidence. It was Peter, a former ally and expert hacker who had gone underground after a failed mission years ago. They had once worked together, but after their last mission together went sideways, they lost contact. I didn't think you'd leave me out of the fun, Peter said, his grin never quite reaching his eyes. I need someone who knows how to break into places that are supposed to be impenetrable, Ethel said. Graves wasn't working alone, and the real power behind him is still out there. We need to find them fast. Peter nodded, his fingers already flying over the nearby computer. I'll get to work. I've got some old contacts who owe me a favor. They'll help us get the intel we need. As Peter plugged in a flash drive and began to decrypt files, Ethel couldn't help but feel the first flickers of hope. This was their chance to take the fight to the heart of the organization, to dismantle it piece by piece before it could become something even more dangerous. The days that followed were a blur of tension and strategy. Peter's connections had proven invaluable, uncovering a network of safe houses, hidden bank accounts, and coded messages that pointed to the organization's leadership. Every lead brought them closer to the truth, but it also made the danger more palpable. They were no longer just dealing with a few rogue agents. They were up against an international syndicate with resources, manpower, and an unyielding desire for control. Ethel stood on the rooftop of their safe house one evening, the city sprawling beneath her. The cool air bit at her skin, and the lights from the streets below flickered like distant stars. It was a beautiful view, but it was hard to appreciate it with the weight of what was coming. We're getting close, Charlie said, joining her on the roof. He handed her a cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool night air. Ethel took it, but her gaze remained fixed on the horizon. Close, but not close enough. Graves might be dead, but there's someone else behind him. Someone who has the resources to keep this fight going. Charlie's voice softened. You think it's a bigger conspiracy? I know it's bigger. This isn't just about control. It's about something more, something far more dangerous. I can feel it in my bones. He leaned against the railing, looking out at the darkened city. We'll stop them, Ethel. Together, we can stop them. She turned to him, her eyes narrowing. I don't know, Charlie. I've seen too much. They're not going to make this easy. We're going to lose people along the way. Charlie gave her a knowing look, his eyes darkened by the burden they both carried. I'm not scared of losing, Ethel. I'm scared of not trying. For a moment, they both stood in silence, the only sound the distant hum of traffic. Then Ethel spoke again, her voice low. I'll fight until the very end, Charlie. But we need to be ready for anything. With each passing day, the mission became more critical. They were closing in on the central hub of the organization, a hidden facility located in the heart of a remote mountain range. The intelligence had pointed them here. This was the place where the true leaders of the operation were based. The team prepared for the final assault. But as Ethel looked over their plan, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. A feeling that had never left her since this whole nightmare had begun. Would they be ready? Would they survive? There was only one way to find out. The mountain loomed in the distance, its snow-capped peaks glistening under the pale moonlight. The road to the facility was winding and treacherous, but Ethel had never been one to shy away from danger. The closer they got, the more the air seemed to grow thick with anticipation, as if the very land was holding its breath for what was to come. The team was silent as they neared their target. Each one of them was focused on the task at hand, and yet, the weight of the mission pressed down on them like a heavy cloak. This was no longer just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything they believed in. The stakes had never been higher. "Everything's ready," Peter said from the driver's seat, his eyes sharp as he navigated the darkened road. "I've got a backdoor into their system. We'll have access to security feeds, communications, and their supply lines." Charlie glanced at Ethel, who was checking her weapons and gear one last time. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice tight with concern. Ethel didn't look up as she adjusted her holster. "It's the only shot we've got. If we don't take it now, they'll just keep coming after us. And next time, it'll be worse. Right?" Charlie didn't press the issue further. He knew her well enough to know when she was set on something. They reached the base of the mountain, where a small outpost was visible through the trees. Ethel signaled for everyone to disembark, and they moved swiftly and silently toward the facility. The wind howled through the narrow paths as they climbed, the harsh cold biting at their skin. The team stayed close, their every step measured and purposeful. Ethel's heart pounded in her chest, but it wasn't fear that made her pulse quicken. It was determination. They had come too far to back down now. At the foot of the facility, Peter worked quickly to hack into the security system, his fingers flying over the device in his hands. "Got it," he muttered under his breath. A moment later, the exterior lights dimmed, and the main entrance door clicked open, giving them the first sign of success. They entered without a sound, their movements fluid and practiced. The halls of the facility were eerily quiet, illuminated only by the faint glow of overhead lights. The place was a maze of sterile white walls and cold metal floors. Everything about it felt unnatural, like something that had been built not to house people, but to control them. "Stay sharp," Ethel whispered. "We're not alone here." They moved through the facility, tracking their movements with a mixture of caution and precision. They passed empty rooms, large storage areas, and sterile laboratories where the evidence of the organization's experiments was evident in every corner. There were files, vials of strange liquids, and equipment designed to test the limits of human endurance, all chilling reminders of what they had been up against. They finally reached a heavily fortified door at the end of the corridor. Peter accessed the system again, bypassing security protocols with expert precision. The door clicked open, revealing a large command center inside, filled with monitors, computers, and rows of high-tech equipment. And there, standing in the center of it all, was a figure Ethel had only heard about in hushed whispers, the leader of the organization. Tall, imposing, with a face obscured by shadows, they turned slowly to face Ethel and the team. "So, you've come this far," the figure said, their voice cold and clipped. "I must admit, I underestimated you." Ethel stepped forward, her hand on her weapon. "This ends now." The figure laughed softly, their fingers steepled in front of them. "You think you can stop what's already in motion? You are but a small inconvenience in a much larger plan." "We've stopped your people before," Charlie said, his voice filled with quiet defiance. "And we'll do it again." The figure tilted their head. "Do you really believe that? You think you can dismantle everything we've built? This isn't about control, child. This is about evolution." Ethel's blood ran cold. She knew the figure was trying to provoke them, trying to make them doubt themselves. But there was no room for hesitation now, not after everything they had been through. "We've already won," Ethel said, her voice hard. "And you're next." Before the figure could react, Peter hit a button on his device, causing the lights to flicker and a loud siren to blare throughout the facility. It was their signal to move in. Ethel and the team launched into action, storming the command center with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Gunfire echoed in the small room as they clashed with the guards stationed around the leader. But they weren't just here to fight. They were here to destroy everything this organization had worked so hard to build. The leader didn't flinch as chaos erupted around them. They stood still, as if expecting it. "Do you really think you can take all of this down?" the leader asked again, their tone almost pitying. Ethel's eyes narrowed. We've already taken the first step. She pulled the trigger. The facility was in ruins. The team had done what they came to do, but the cost was high. They had fought through waves of security, sabotaged key infrastructure, and destroyed vital research. And yet, the leader had managed to slip away, vanishing into the chaos like a ghost. Ethel stood at the wreckage, the sound of alarms and the distant crackle of flames filling the air. She felt the weight of the victory in her chest, but also the heaviness of the unknown. The leader's words echoed in her mind. This is just the beginning. We've hit them hard, Charlie said from behind her. He was bruised, bloodied, but alive. But they're not finished yet. Ethel turned to him, her face hard. No, they're not. But we've made them bleed. And that's a start. Peter, who had been checking the system for any remaining data, looked up. We've got enough to make a real dent. But I'm telling you, Ethel, there's more of them out there. We've only seen a small piece of the puzzle. I know, Ethel replied. The team gathered in the war room, the mood tense but resolute. Ethel stood at the head of the table, her eyes scanning the maps, the satellite images, and the notes they had painstakingly gathered over the past few weeks. Everything was set. They had everything they needed, except the one thing that haunted Ethel's every thought, the unknown. Charlie entered, his brow furrowed. I've got a bad feeling about this, Ethel. There's too much going right, too much lining up. It feels too clean. I know, Ethel replied, her voice steady despite the flutter of doubt gnawing at her. That's why we need to move quickly. If this is a trap, we'll spring it before they have time to react. The plan was simple. Infiltrate the facility, neutralize the leadership, and retrieve whatever classified information they could find on the organization's global operations. The team would enter under the cover of darkness, using the cover of a nearby forest to conceal their movements. They'd have one shot, one chance to stop whatever twisted plans were in motion before they could go further. Peter, now fully integrated into the team, stood near the back of the room, his eyes glued to the terminal screen. He glanced up at Ethel. We'll have about 20 minutes of complete surveillance blackout as soon as we hit their perimeter. After that, we'll be blind. Ethel nodded. That's all we need. Once we're inside, we hit the main targets, grab any intel, and then get out. No time for second chances. Charlie cracked his knuckles. I'll lead the breach team. You focus on the data, Ethel. Ethel met his gaze. I'll get it, and I'll keep you safe. The night was cold and still as they made their approach. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, making it difficult to see even a few feet ahead. The van bumped over uneven terrain as it slowly crept toward the entrance, hidden beneath the dense tree cover. The team's hearts were synchronized, the silence between them heavier than the air itself. Ethel's fingers tightened around her rifle. She felt the familiar weight of it, the cold steel against her hands grounding her in the present moment. This wasn't about vengeance anymore. This was about survival. Charlie whispered into the comms, his voice clipped and professional. We're in position. On my mark. 3, 2, 1. The van stopped, and the team moved quickly, slipping out into the shadows. They were ghosts in the night, quiet and unseen. Ethel's heart pounded as they approached the entrance of the facility, a stark, fortified building tucked against the mountainside. It was a fortress, built to withstand any assault, and they were going to make it theirs. The breach team, led by Charlie, moved swiftly to the door, using cutting-edge explosives to silently open it. The air was thick with anticipation as Ethel, Peter, and the rest of the team crouched low, ready for whatever awaited them on the other side. With a low thud, the door exploded inward, and Charlie was the first to move, leading the charge as the team followed. Ethel's senses were razor-sharp. They moved through the building in tight formation, their footsteps silent as they passed through dimly lit corridors and into the heart of the complex. They encountered no resistance. Too easy. A cold shiver ran down Ethel's spine. This wasn't going according to plan. The central control room loomed ahead, a sleek, high-tech nerve center. Ethel's breath caught in her throat as she stepped inside. The flicker of screens and the hum of machinery filled the air. Nothing, Peter muttered as he began to tap into the systems, his fingers flying over the keyboard. It's too quiet. I'm not getting anything. This place is locked down tighter than Fort Knox. Ethel stepped forward, scanning the room. Stay sharp. They'll be watching. Just as Peter's fingers hovered over the final security key, the door slammed shut with a deafening clang. Ethel spun, her hand flying to her weapon, but it was too late. The trap had sprung. From the shadows of the control room emerged several armed men, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. Ethel's pulse quickened, but she didn't falter. This was a setup, and they had walked right into it. A voice echoed from the speakers. Did you really think it would be this easy, Ethel? The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She recognized the voice. It was a voice she'd heard only once before, and it sent a surge of dread through her body. It was Graves. The digital screens flickered to life, showing his face, now bruised and bloodied but unmistakably alive. The man who they had left for dead was now sitting comfortably at the head of a much larger operation, laughing at their misfortune. You didn't think I'd leave things to chance, did you? You've been a thorn in my side, but now the real fun begins. Ethel clenched her teeth. You're supposed to be dead. I was, Graves replied coldly. But you were so kind to make sure that my plans were far from over. Welcome to the real enemy. Welcome to the beginning of the end. A countdown began flashing on the screens. 10, 9, 8. Ethel didn't need to look at Charlie or the others. The time for hesitation was over. The game had just changed, and now it was up to them to survive it. The countdown ticked away, but the team wasn't ready to give up. Ethel's mind raced, calculating their next move, while Charlie and the others moved into position, taking cover. We can't let him get away with this, Ethel muttered. This is just the start. We need to get out of here and stop him for good. As the countdown reached its final seconds, the team made a run for it, weaving between cover as the building around them erupted into chaos. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. This was war. The countdown reached 0 with a deafening blast. The walls trembled as the entire facility shook from the explosion. Ethel's heart slammed against her chest as the shockwave rippled through the room, sending debris scattering across the floor. The team dove to the ground, seeking shelter behind anything that could shield them from the blast. Move! Charlie shouted through the chaos, his voice a commanding bark as he grabbed Ethel by the arm and pulled her toward the exit. We need to get out now. Ethel barely registered his words before she found herself running, sprinting through the smoke and debris. The building was collapsing around them. It wasn't just a trap, it was a full-scale assault, and they were caught in the middle of it. Behind them, the countdown had been the beginning of a much larger plan, one that threatened to bring the entire facility down. Go, 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 Peter urged, his voice cutting through the turmoil. They ran through the corridors, past rooms filled with tangled wires and sparks flying from severed conduits. The sound of collapsing walls echoed behind them. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning materials. But there was no time to stop. Not yet. Where's the exit? Ethel yelled, her voice barely audible over the roar of the explosion's aftermath. Charlie pointed ahead. Down the hall. We've got a window to escape. But as they neared the exit, they were met with more resistance. A squad of armed men emerged from the shadows, weapons raised. The dim light gleamed off their armored suits as they aimed their rifles at the team. Ethel's heart skipped a beat. The odds were stacking against them faster than she could think. But there was no fear in her, only clarity. This was what they had trained for. Take cover, she ordered, and the team scattered, diving behind walls and support beams. The air was filled with the staccato of gunfire, the sounds of bullets ripping through the air. Charlie was the first to return fire, his rifle spitting deadly rounds as he laid down a suppressive barrage, keeping the attackers pinned down. Ethel moved swiftly to a different angle, aiming carefully, firing to take out the enemy one by one. The team was working in perfect unison, their years of experience coming into play. Every shot, every movement, was deliberate. But time was running out. We've got to keep moving, Peter shouted, his voice strained. The exit's right there, but we don't have much time before the whole building goes up. Ethel nodded, already sprinting forward, leading the way. Charlie followed, his gun blazing. The rest of the team was right behind them, all pushing forward with the determination of soldiers who knew what was at stake. Just as they neared the exit, the ground beneath them shook again, a violent tremor that sent the entire building swaying. The overhead lights flickered and then went out entirely, plunging them into total darkness. "Stay close," Ethel shouted as she reached the heavy steel door. She punched in the emergency override, and the door groaned open with a mechanical hiss. Freedom was just a step away, but as they rushed through the door, the sky above them exploded in a brilliant flash of white light. The world outside was chaos. The explosion had been far larger than expected. The facility had detonated with enough force to send shockwaves through the surrounding area. The team was thrown to the ground by the sheer power of the blast, their bodies skidding across the dirt as dust and debris rained down from above. Ethel pushed herself to her knees, coughing violently as the air around her turned thick with smoke. Her ears rang, and for a moment, everything was a blur of disorientation. She wiped blood from her brow, her hand trembling. "Ethel," Charlie's voice broke through the ringing, and she looked up to see him, already on his feet, helping Peter up from the rubble. "We need to move," he said urgently, his voice grim. "This place is going to be swarming with reinforcements any minute. We're sitting ducks out here." Ethel nodded, forcing herself to stand. The blast had thrown them farther than she realized, half a mile at least, but they had no time to worry about the distance. They had to disappear before anyone came to investigate. "Move," she shouted. The team gathered their bearings and started running, weaving through the smoke and debris. The landscape around them had been shattered, the ground scorched, trees uprooted, and the once pristine facility now a smoldering ruin in the distance. The sound of helicopters began to fill the air, and Ethel's gut twisted. They had to get off the ground before they were spotted. She scanned the horizon, spotting a dense forest line just a few hundred yards away. "There," she pointed, and they sprinted toward the cover of the trees, hearts racing, adrenaline coursing through their veins. As they reached the trees, they slowed their pace, trying to catch their breath. The danger was far from over, but they had escaped the worst of it, for now. "We need to regroup," Peter said, pulling up a map from his bag. "There's an extraction point 2 miles north of here. We can make it if we move fast." Ethel nodded. "Let's go." They started moving again, making their way through the woods, their eyes constantly scanning for any signs of pursuit. Every step felt heavier, but there was no turning back. They had come this far, and they couldn't afford to fail now. The weight of the mission still loomed large. Graves was out there, waiting for them. The war wasn't over. But now, they had a new purpose, stopping him, once and for all. And this time, they wouldn't make the same mistake again. The forest was eerily quiet, save for the soft crunch of leaves beneath their boots. Ethel pushed forward, eyes sharp, alert for any movement, her hand always hovering near her weapon. The sounds of helicopters had faded, but they couldn't afford to let their guard down. Every second could bring an ambush. Charlie, who had taken point, slowed his pace and turned back to the group. His expression was grim, and his brow furrowed in concentration. "We've got movement ahead," he whispered. "Stay low." The team instinctively dropped to a crouch, using the trees as cover. They moved in perfect sync, a well-oiled machine. As they crept through the underbrush, the distance to their extraction point growing smaller with each cautious step. Minutes later, Ethel caught a glimpse of figures ahead. Through the trees, she saw the dark silhouettes of several men, moving methodically through the forest. They weren't part of the team, and they didn't look friendly. "Enemies," Peter murmured, his voice low. Ethel nodded, her mind racing. They were getting close to the extraction point, but these men could make their escape impossible. She held up a hand to signal the group to stop. Charlie crouched beside her, his eyes scanning the enemy positions. "What's the play?" Ethel considered their options quickly. The last thing they needed was a firefight that would draw attention. But if they didn't act, they risked being trapped. "We split up," she decided. "We'll take them from different angles. If we're quiet enough, we can neutralize them before they even know we're here." Charlie's eyes gleamed with approval. "I'll take the right flank." "I'll cover the left," Peter said, a glint of determination in his eyes. Ethel took a deep breath and nodded. I'll move in from the center. We'll hit them hard and fast. No hesitation. The teams spread out, moving with practiced silence through the dense forest. Ethel's pulse quickened, her focus narrowing to the target. She knew this was risky, too risky. But the longer they stayed, the more likely it was that more enemies would arrive. They had to neutralize this threat now. The first of the men came into view, a tall figure, walking away from their position, unaware of their presence. Ethel's hand tightened around her rifle as she lined up the shot, careful not to make a sound. One shot. That's all it would take. She fired, the rifle's sharp report cutting through the air. The man crumpled to the ground. No time to react. Go, she whispered, motioning to the others. The team moved like shadows, each of them slipping into position. Peter took out another soldier, a clean shot to the back, while Charlie dropped a third with a swift maneuver that barely made a sound. Ethel moved forward, taking down the final two before they even knew what hit them. In less than 2 minutes, the forest was quiet again. The soldiers lay motionless on the ground, their weapons discarded and their lives snuffed out in the blink of an eye. Ethel wiped her brow, glancing at the others. Move, she commanded, and the team began to move again, this time with even greater urgency. The extraction point was just ahead. They could hear the distant hum of a helicopter, the sound growing louder as they approached. Ethel's heart thudded in her chest. Finally, they were close to safety. But the world had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected it. As they neared the extraction point, the sound of gunfire erupted from behind them, followed by the unmistakable roar of a heavy vehicle engine. Ethel cursed under her breath. We've been spotted. The helicopter was waiting for them, just as promised, but the enemy wasn't far behind. They could hear the growl of the armored vehicle engine getting closer, the tires screeching as it tore through the forest in pursuit. The extraction was supposed to be smooth, but now it was anything but. Go, go, go. Charlie yelled as they sprinted the last few yards toward the waiting helicopter. The pilot, a grizzled man with a stoic expression, waved them toward the open door. But as Ethel reached the helicopter, she turned just in time to see the vehicle break through the trees, a hulking machine barreling toward them. The enemy wasn't just going to let them escape. The vehicle opened fire, bullets tearing through the air as the helicopter lifted off, the sound of the rotor blades slicing the sky. Ethel dove into the cabin, and the door slammed shut behind her just as the vehicle's firepower exploded against the chopper's side. The impact sent a jolt through the helicopter, but it held steady. Inside, the team was breathless, their bodies aching from the sprint and the weight of the battle they just fought. But they were alive, and that was all that mattered. Hold on, the pilot shouted. This is going to get rough. The helicopter veered hard to the left, narrowly avoiding a hail of gunfire. The landscape below them blurred as the pilot skillfully dodged incoming fire from the vehicle, a mix of bullets and rocket-propelled grenades that missed by mere inches. Ethel's mind raced. The danger wasn't over. They had made it out, but they weren't safe yet. Graves was still out there, and the clock was ticking down to the final confrontation. She gripped the seat tightly, her gaze locked on the horizon as the helicopter soared higher into the sky, leaving the burning forest behind. But something gnawed at her, an unsettling feeling, a premonition. The real war was just beginning. The helicopter's engine roared as it climbed higher, the landscape below shrinking into a patchwork of greens and browns. Ethel leaned back in her seat, her mind still racing. The team had made it out of the forest, but they weren't free yet. The enemy's pursuit wasn't over. This was just the beginning. The other team members were silent, each of them processing the danger they had narrowly escaped. Charlie was staring out the window, his jaw clenched. Peter had his eyes closed, his fingers drumming on his leg nervously. Ethel knew they were all thinking the same thing. Graves? They hadn't eliminated the real threat, only delayed it. The pilot's voice broke through the tension. We're approaching the safe house. We'll land in 5 minutes. Ethel nodded. Thanks. She took a deep breath and reached for her communications device, her fingers hovering over the buttons. She needed to check in. They had left too much unfinished in that forest, and Graves would be preparing for the next move. There was no way he would let this go without a fight. The radio crackled to life. "Ethel, it's Anderson. Report." Ethel quickly relayed the details of the operation, the ambush, the escape, and their current status. "We're heading for the safe house now. I don't think Graves is going to back off this easily. He'll regroup and come for us." Anderson's voice was calm, but Ethel could hear the weight of his concern. "Understood. We've got a secondary team moving in to provide backup, just in case. We'll be ready for whatever comes next." She nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "Thanks, Anderson. We'll need every hand we can get." The helicopter began to descend as they approached the safe house, a hidden location in the mountains, a place that had served as a refuge in past missions. The familiar sight of its isolated, fortress-like structure was a welcome one. But Ethel's relief was short-lived. She knew the moment they touched down, the battle would only escalate. As the helicopter touched the ground with a soft thud, Ethel was already unstrapping her harness. She was out of the door before the helicopter fully landed, her boots hitting the dirt as she scanned the surroundings. The team quickly followed, their weapons drawn, moving with military precision. "Clear," Charlie called, scanning the perimeter. Peter jogged to the back of the building, checking the windows. "All clear here." Ethel gave a sharp nod. "Let's move inside. We've got no time to waste." The safe house was modest, simple concrete walls, a few rooms, and a basement that housed the equipment they would need for their next move. As they entered, Ethel quickly took charge. "Set up in the main room. We need to get the latest intel on Graves, and we need to do it fast. Charlie, Peter, start checking the comms. I'll get in touch with HQ." The team immediately got to work, and Ethel moved toward a desk in the corner of the room, where a satellite phone waited. She picked it up, dialing a secure number. Her heart thudded in her chest as the phone rang. "Ethel, it's Anderson again. What's the status?" His voice was tense, but there was an undercurrent of resolve. "We've made it to the safe house," Ethel replied quickly. "But Graves isn't going to let this go. We need to track his movements. We need everything we can on his next target." Anderson was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was tight with urgency. "We've intercepted communications. Graves has a secondary base of operations. It's north of here, near the border. We suspect he's consolidating forces for a final push. We'll need to move quickly to intercept before he can mobilize." Ethel's pulse quickened. "How soon can we get a strike team in place?" "ASAP. We'll have a team on the ground in 2 hours. You need to hold position until then. We can't risk moving too soon. Graves is getting smarter." She clenched her jaw. She hated waiting, but she knew Anderson was right. They couldn't risk an early assault without the proper backup. "Understood. We'll hold." As she set the phone down, she turned to the team. "We've got a window. We move on Graves' secondary base in 2 hours. We need to be ready." The tension in the room was palpable, each of them understanding the weight of what lay ahead. It wasn't just about stopping Graves. It was about stopping a force that could destabilize entire regions. The stakes had never been higher. Peter walked over, his voice low. "Do you think we can pull it off?" Ethel met his gaze, her mind already calculating their next steps. "We have no choice. This ends now." She wasn't about to let Graves win. Not after everything they had sacrificed. As the team made preparations, Ethel stood by the window, looking out at the mountains in the distance. The quiet was deceiving. Beneath the surface, there was a storm gathering. And when it broke, it would be more destructive than anything they had faced. She turned back to the team, her expression hardening. "Let's get ready. We're going in full force." 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation. The team had gone over every detail of the mission, checked their gear, and reviewed the intel they had on Graves' secondary base. Ethel could feel the weight of the mission settling on her shoulders, but there was no room for doubt. This had to be done. The helicopter would be their transport once again, but this time, they would be going into enemy territory, and they wouldn't be alone. The secondary strike team would join them on the ground, creating a two-pronged assault designed to overwhelm Graves' forces. As the helicopter lifted off once more, Ethel looked around at the team. Charlie's jaw was set in determination. Peter's hands were steady on his rifle, and even though the tension was thick in the air, there was a shared understanding between them. They would finish this, no matter what. The storm was coming. The helicopter cut through the cold mountain air, its blades slicing the silence. Ethel's eyes were fixed on the landscape below, the rugged terrain giving way to dense forests that concealed the secondary base of Graves' operation. Her mind raced, running through the possible scenarios as they neared their destination. This was the final confrontation. The pilot's voice crackled through the comms, snapping Ethel from her thoughts. 30 seconds to drop zone. Hold tight. The team tensed, bracing for impact. Charlie and Peter secured their gear, checking their weapons once more. Ethel did the same, every movement deliberate. There was no room for error now. Graves had been one step ahead of them for too long, and this time, they were going to cut him off before he could disappear again. The helicopter began its descent, the trees below growing larger with each passing second. The drop zone was a clearing just outside the perimeter of the base. It was the perfect spot for a covert insertion, close enough to strike quickly, but far enough to avoid detection until the last moment. The chopper touched down with a soft thud, the rotors kicking up dust and debris. The team quickly disembarked, moving with practiced precision. They kept low, sprinting toward the tree line where the secondary strike team was waiting for them. Ethel's heart pounded in her chest. She didn't need to look back to know the secondary team was right behind them. Their objective was simple: storm the base, eliminate any threats, and capture Graves, if possible. But Ethel knew there was no guarantee. Graves had built a network of loyal followers, and this was his last stand. "Move out," Ethel commanded, her voice steady. She motioned for Charlie and Peter to take the left flank while she led the right, keeping their formation tight as they closed in on the base. The trees thinned, and the fortified compound came into view. Watchtowers rose above the walls, guards patrolling the perimeter, unaware of the incoming assault. Ethel's eyes scanned the area, noting every potential threat. "Ready?" Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. Ethel nodded, signaling for the team to spread out. They had to approach from multiple angles to maximize their chances of success. As the first shots rang out from the secondary team, the base erupted into chaos. The enemy was caught off guard, and Ethel seized the opportunity. She sprinted forward, cutting through the underbrush, her heart pounding in her chest. They were getting closer, closer to Graves. Suddenly, a guard emerged from the shadows, gun raised. Ethel's instincts took over. She lunged, tackling him to the ground, knocking the weapon from his hands. Her knee pressed into his chest as she quickly incapacitated him with a swift blow to the temple. "Clear," she whispered, rising to her feet. The rest of the team was already in position, sweeping through the compound, eliminating guards and disabling security systems. Ethel's pulse quickened as they neared the main building. This was it. They would either find Graves here, or they would have to track him down, no matter the cost. Charlie motioned for her to follow as they approached the doors to the building. They moved silently, their steps muffled by the dirt and grass beneath them. Ethel's hand hovered over the door handle, a sense of anticipation building in her chest. With a sharp tug, she yanked the door open, and the team stormed inside. The interior was dark, the low hum of electricity the only sound as they advanced. They moved cautiously, clearing each room as they went. Ethel's mind was focused. Graves had to be here somewhere. A door at the end of the hallway creaked open, and Ethel froze. She raised her weapon, signaling for the team to take position. The silence in the room was deafening. Then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward. It was Graves. He stood there, calm, collected, his cold eyes meeting Ethel's with a knowing look. The man who had masterminded this entire operation. The man who had nearly brought the world to its knees. "Ethel," he said, his voice smooth, almost friendly. "I knew you'd come. You always do." Ethel's fingers tightened around the grip of her weapon. "This ends now, Graves." He smirked, as if the weight of the situation was nothing more than a game. "You think you can stop me? You've been chasing shadows for too long." The room was charged with tension. Ethel could feel the electricity in the air, the anticipation hanging on the edge of a knife. Graves wasn't backing down. He never had. "Why?" Ethel demanded. "Why do all of this? For power? For control? For what?" Graves' expression hardened, the smugness fading. You wouldn't understand. People like you think in simple terms. You see right and wrong. I see opportunity. I see the world as it could be remade. Ethel shook her head, her voice cold. The world doesn't need to be remade. It needs to be saved. Graves chuckled, his eyes flickering with something dark. You're too late for that. Without warning, he reached for a hidden compartment on his belt, and Ethel's instincts kicked in. She fired, the shot echoing through the room. But Graves was fast, his movements precise. He ducked to the side, narrowly avoiding the bullet. The room erupted into chaos. Gunfire filled the air as the team moved into action, returning fire. Ethel sprinted toward Graves, her every muscle screaming for action. She had to end this now. Graves darted toward the rear of the room, disappearing into a shadowy corridor. Ethel's eyes narrowed. There was no escape for him now. She wasn't going to let him slip through her fingers. Stay with me, she called to the team. They followed in close pursuit, determined not to let Graves get away. Ethel's heart raced as she closed the gap, every step bringing her closer to the man who had caused so much pain. They rounded a corner, and there he was, waiting. Graves turned, his expression calm once more, but this time, Ethel was ready. This time, there would be no more running. Ethel stood at the threshold, her gun steady, her eyes locked on Graves. The dim light from a single overhead bulb flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with tension, the silence before the storm, the moment before everything changed. Graves was cornered, but he was far from beaten. His lips curled into a faint smile, and he took a step back, disappearing momentarily into the darkness behind him. You've come a long way, Ethel, he said, his voice almost a whisper. But this is where it ends. Ethel's heart pounded in her chest. She knew that tone, the one that signaled a trap. She motioned for the team to spread out, taking cover behind nearby crates and equipment. There was no telling what kind of final gambit Graves had prepared. He had always been one step ahead, always had a plan, no matter how dire the situation seemed. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Ethel called out, her voice firm but not without a hint of weariness. Give it up. It's over. There was a long pause, and then Graves stepped into the light once more. This time, he was holding something, an old, rusted detonator. His smirk was wide, almost gleeful. You think I'm afraid of death? Graves sneered. This is bigger than me, bigger than you. Ethel's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? He chuckled, shaking his head. It's not about control anymore. It's about leaving a mark on the world, a mark no one can erase. You think taking me down will stop the chaos? The world has already been set in motion. The gears are turning, Ethel. Even if I go, it's too late. You'll never stop what's coming. Ethel's mind raced. A detonator? A bomb? Where was it? Where was the threat? Suddenly, the sound of an engine roared to life outside the building, followed by the unmistakable sound of an aircraft rising into the sky. You're too late, Graves said, his voice almost pitying. I've already activated it. There's no turning back now. Ethel's blood ran cold. The helicopter. It was already airborne. He had planned this. He had set the stage for his escape, no matter what happened to him here. Where is it, Graves? Ethel demanded, stepping forward. Tell me where it is. Graves looked at her with disdain. Even if you kill me now, you won't save the world. You'll just delay the inevitable. Go ahead, pull the trigger. But it won't change anything. Ethel's mind was a whirlwind. She could kill him now, but if there was a bomb, if there was something far bigger than him, what if stopping him didn't stop the real threat? But she couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. Peter, Charlie, check the perimeter, she said, her voice hard. I'm not letting him get away. The two men moved quickly, guns drawn, fanning out to cover every angle. Ethel's attention stayed fixed on Graves. You can't run from this, Ethel, Graves sneered. You're just like everyone else. You think you can stop fate. I've stopped plenty of things in my life, Ethel said, her gaze unwavering. And you're next. Graves' smirk faltered slightly as he took a step back, eyeing the exit. You really think you can win this? You've lost before you even understood the game. Suddenly, There was a loud crash from the far side of the room. Ethel turned just in time to see Charlie go down in a heap, the explosion of a flashbang blinding everyone for a split second. "Move!" Ethel shouted, diving for cover. The whole room seemed to explode into action. Gunfire, shouts, and the echo of a helicopter's blades growing louder. In the chaos, Ethel barely noticed Graves slipping toward the rear exit. He was making his final move. "Damn it," Ethel hissed, darting after him. She couldn't lose him now. The team regrouped quickly, and they sprinted through the corridors of the building, hot on Graves' heels. Ethel's pulse raced as they neared the rear exit. Graves was getting away, but not without a fight. As they reached the door, Ethel saw the unmistakable flash of Graves' figure darting outside. She fired, but missed by inches as he disappeared into the darkness of the night. The team quickly followed, not wanting to let him slip through their fingers. Outside, the helicopter was just beginning to rise, its engine screaming as it lifted off into the sky. "We can't let him escape," Peter shouted. Ethel didn't need to be told twice. She sprinted toward the nearest vehicle, slamming into the door and yanking it open. The sound of the helicopter's blades was deafening now, and the team scrambled into the vehicles as the helicopter made a sharp turn. "Get to the highway," Ethel ordered. "We have to cut him off before he gets too far." The vehicles roared to life as they sped toward the main road, the helicopter already far ahead but still within range. The tension in Ethel's chest felt unbearable as they pushed the engines to their limit, the landscape flashing by in a blur of headlights and shadows. The helicopter was fast, but it wasn't invincible. They could still catch it. Graves had nowhere to go. This time, Ethel would make sure of it.